All right. Hello again, everybody. So we read What Should a Billionaire Give? What Should You? And in that text, he outlines a couple of different objections to the famine relief argument. Singer does. So, and we're also going to be looking at some other objections to the argument as well. So, so first of all, we get what Singer calls the causal objection. So the idea here is that if we haven't done anything to cause global famine and global poverty, well, then we're not responsible for ending global poverty or global famine, right? So, so we're only morally responsible to people or to beings that we have caused them to be in the situation that they are in. So the idea here is that we have done nothing to cause the suffering and death of those who live across the world. So we have no obligation to help those people. Here we might think of the objection as an attempt to revise premise 2. So recall premise 2 is our principle, our weaker and stronger principle. So this might be an attempt to revise this premise. So we morally ought to prevent something bad from happening when it is at little or no cost to ourselves. But here's where it's different. Only if we have caused in some way the bad thing to happen, right? So only if indicates a necessary condition. So we have a moral obligation to prevent bad things from happening only when we have first caused or have contributed to the cause of that bad thing to happen, right? So for instance, or for example, I should say, is that in the pond example, we are off the hook. We are not morally obligated to save the kid in the pond. So I can say, well, look, kid, I didn't put you in the pond, so I can walk away from you, right? And so if we go with this causal objection, right, well, we're going to get potentially a weird outcome in the pond example, right? Namely, we don't have to save the kid in the pond, which seems very morally suspicious. Secondly, Thomas Pogge offers what he calls the causal argument, where we are actually, in fact, responsible for so much of the global suffering and global famine in the world, right? Global poverty. So the idea here is that corporations buy natural resources from many different nations, right? And these nations, the governments there may have legitimacy or they may have no legitimacy, right? And so given that these corporations just buy raw materials from all of these nations, regardless of the legitimacy of the government, this practice incentivizes rebellions, right, or revolutions, where you have a frequent sort of turnover in the governmental power of these like sort of impoverished nations. And so when there are all of these shifts in the government or all these different revolutions, right, they don't do anything to assist those who are in need in those countries, right? There's just this kind of struggle for who's going to control the government, right? And so given that our corporations, which we all sort of buy from, are engaged in this very problematic behavior that ends up keeping down those who are impoverished, right? We are somewhat responsible for those who live in poverty, right? So this is a highly empirical argument. I don't really know how to verify it, right? But if it's true, if this is right, well, then we can still, we are obligated still to assist those who are impoverished because we are partly responsible for putting them there to begin with, right? So this may be a good response to the objection. It may not be a good response to the objection. That's up for you to decide. Okay, next we have what I'm calling the libertarian objection. So libertarians, I'm sure we've talked about this earlier, but if not, I'm going to talk about it now. Libertarians think that all rights that we have are negative rights. So what's the difference between a negative and a positive right? A positive right involves two things, namely that we have to do something for you and that we have to refrain from doing some things to you, right? So let's take the right to life, for example. If the right to life is positive, then I can't hit you in the face with a baseball bat. I can't do anything that would pose risks on ending your life, right? Um, um, but I also have to do certain things for you, right? So for instance, if you are at risk of dying, right, and I'm in a position to assist you, then I may have to go and act in order to save your life, right? So I have to refrain from certain things and I have to do certain things for you, given that you have the positive right to life. Now, negative rights are different. They say that we only have to refrain from doing certain things to other people, right? So for instance, if the right to life is negative, right, then I don't have to do anything for you to make your life go better or make your life longer. Rather, I only have to refrain from doing certain things to you. I can't shoot you. I can't hit you in the face with a baseball bat. And that's the limit of our rights. So you can kind of see where this might be going. So libertarians think that all rights are negative. And so all rights merely involve refraining from doing certain things to other people, right? We're just kind of this bubble of rights, and people like are constantly infringing on our rights. And so what we have to do is just refrain from infringing on other people's rights. Okay, so why might this be a problem for the argument? Well, if the right to life is negative, then you don't have to save the kid in the pond, right? Because going into the pond and saving the kid is a thing that you have to do, right? And so if we're obligated to save the kid, right, then that means that the right to life is positive, because that it would involve us having to do something to save a life. However, the libertarian says that, look, no, the right to life is negative. So you could actually just ignore the kid and you're not doing anything morally wrong, right? So similarly, we can see where this objection might be headed for the larger argument in general, right? So if the right to life is negative, right, then people who are suffering and dying from global poverty, we don't have any obligation to them because we don't have to do anything for them. We don't have to give them anything, right? The only obligation we have is not to kick them, not to hit them with a baseball bat, not to shoot them, not to kill them, right? Or do things that would lead to the end of their life. So we can kind of see where this might be a problem, right? And so here we may respond by saying, well, look, clearly we're obligated to save the kid in the pond, right? Suppose that you have that intuition. Well, given that this view is telling us that we're not obligated to save the kid, well, that's maybe a suspicious reason, right? So maybe we are actually obligated to the kid. And if we are obligated to the kid in the pond, then that's a reason to think that the right to life is actually positive, meaning that we have to do things for other people. So anyway, this is just another objection to think about. Yeah, okay. And then lastly, we have what I'm going to call the moral significance of property objection. So here's a claim. It might be morally significant to hold property, right? So we may ask ourselves, So if you own something, it might be that the relationship that you have with that thing, right? So suppose I own this coffee mug, right? And I'm the property holder of this coffee mug. It's got sushi all over it. I love this coffee mug. Okay, so we might think that this is my property and that this coffee mug is morally significant because it belongs to me, right? Okay, so so if that's right, then when we own things, everything that we own is morally significant, right? And so if our property is morally significant, then according to the weaker or moderate version of the argument, we would not have to give anything away, right? Because everything is morally significant. And the weaker version of the argument, or the moderate version of the argument, demands we give away things that aren't morally significant. So the goal of this objection is to limit the scope of the weaker version of the argument, right? So so the idea here is that, look, if you own something, then that thing is morally significant. Well, why think that it's morally significant? Well, suppose I steal something from you, right? It seems like I've done something wrong to you, right? And it may one explanation for why I've done something morally wrong to you is because that object, say this mug, is morally significant because it's your property, right? So um, so we might have a couple of different responses here, right? So let's look at a couple of them. So we might think, first of all, that property itself is not morally significant, right? There may be some morally significant property, but not all property is morally significant merely because it's property. So we might have some property that is morally insignificant, say this mug, right? But what is morally, well, so why is it wrong to steal? If property is not morally significant, then why is it wrong to steal? Well, here's one reason to think that stealing is bad, is because the object or the property object, like the mug, is not morally significant. Rather, it's the property holder that's morally significant, right? And so we might say that because I'm morally significant, right, I have a property right over something that's morally insignificant. Well, then that's what explains why it's wrong to steal, right? So according, if this is right, that property holders are morally significant, well, then it seems pretty clear that I think it seems pretty clear that I would have to give away a lot of different things because the mug itself is, say, morally insignificant. My shoes themselves are morally insignificant. But we can say that they're morally insignificant and it's still wrong to steal them too, right? Okay. So that's like one response. Here's another response from Peter Unger, another philosopher, a lot of Peters in this literature. So let's suppose that you walk by a large lake and see a woman struggling to tread water, right? So it's kind of, you kind of see her way out in the distance. It looks like she will drown if she's not rescued shortly. Suppose that there's a storm on the horizon, right? So the storm is coming. If the storm comes, she's probably going to die. You see a yacht on a dock nearby, and there's a sign on it that says, "Do not under any circumstances touch this yacht." With the coming storm, you estimate that the yacht will sustain about $10,000 of damage, right? And you're also broke, so you would never be able to pay back the millionaire for the damages maintained from the storm, right? So what should you do? Should you steal the yacht to save the person, right? Should you respect the millionaire's property rights over the yacht and let the person die, right? So it seems pretty intuitive that even if you sustain damage to the yacht, and even if you can't pay it back, that the morally right thing to do is to steal in order to save the life, right? And so if that's the correct analysis of the case, well, then we find that property rights are not absolute. They're actually quite overridable, right? And you can even imagine like talking to the millionaire, you're like, look, I saved a lady's life, and that's how all of this damage got to your boat, right? I had a good reason. We could also imagine the millionaires being very understanding about that, right? So if property rights aren't absolute, then the moral gravity of a given situation will override our property rights sometimes, right? And so I think that Peter Singer will try to make the case that global poverty is one of these instances where our property rights are overridden. Okay, so in this lecture, we've talked about three objections. We talked about the causal objection. We talked about the libertarian objection, and then the moral significance of property objection. So anyway, thank you all for listening to this lecture, and I guess I'll see you all very soon.